Thus far, we've assumed that a firm will sell identical products at an identical price in all market segments. But that's not always the case. When a firm sells a product in multiple markets, they sometimes sell them for different prices depending on who they're selling it to. This is called price discrimination. Now, the use of discrimination is not meant to be negative. It's just a positive statement describing what's happening. In this case, we're literally means we're charging two groups of people different prices. Now, this occurs in many situations, more common than you might imagine. So the conditions for price discrimination that are required for it to exist and persist is first that the markets that we're selling in must be completely separate. What we mean by that is that there's no resale going on between the markets. If someone in one market can buy at a lower price and then sell it at a higher price, that's a profit opportunity, and they're going to take advantage of that. Once they figure it out, they'll take advantage, and then it'll slowly compete the difference in prices away. It'll end up increasing demand in the market selling for lower prices, shifting the demand curve to the right, increasing the quantity being sold there, but also increasing the price. That's going to drive up the price. At the same time, the demand for the high-priced product is going to decrease. That's going to drive down the quantity being bought and sold in that market and the price at which it's being sold. Those both will continue until they reach the same price, and all differences in price have been eliminated. Also, the demand curves in the segmented markets have to have different elasticities at different prices. Without this, price discrimination would not be in the firm's best interest. The demand elasticities, frequently what that comes down to is individuals' income. So people in one segment, in one market segment, have lower incomes than consumers in the other market segment. So they're more sensitive to a change in price. So they'll try to sell a lower price to individuals with lower incomes and then make more money by selling at a higher price to individuals with higher incomes. And when we walk through some examples, you'll see how this takes place. So economists identify 3 degrees of price discrimination. So the first degree of price discrimination is the rarest, but it's the most profitable for the seller. So under first degree price discrimination, sellers can identify exactly where each consumer lands on the demand curve. That means that they know the exact willingness and ability to pay for each consumer. In this case, the demand curve also becomes the marginal revenue curve, and this allows the seller to extract the greatest amounts of profits in this industry. Now, this is obviously extremely rare because it requires an insane amount of information about the consumer. Your textbook calls it, I believe, Herculean amount. The closest example we have that is something that might actually occur in the real world is a consumer purchasing a new automobile from a car salesman. Don't imagine the kind of greasy used car salesman like Danny DeVito would play in a movie, but an actual one that has enough data and enough cunning ability for that salesperson to figure out exactly where each consumer lies on the demand curve and their willingness and ability to pay through a conversation with them and through the background information about things like their income, their expenditures, information like that. In this case, the dealer could obtain a price from each single consumer and offer them exactly what they were willing and able to pay, like the highest price they're willing and able to pay. Of course, in a competitive market, this is going to be very difficult. Even if you obtain all that information, another competitor could come in and offer a lower price, either because they know and they're choosing to undercut you, or because they don't know and they're just guessing and they guess slightly lower. The second degree of price discrimination is also fairly rare in the real world, although it's more common than first degree price discrimination. So basically, in secondary price discrimination, you sell a product at different prices by what they call blocks of services. So an example is how public utilities tend to price their services. So they'll charge the highest unit price or the highest price, per unit of electricity for very small quantities being used at the very top of the demand curve. And they'll charge lower prices as the rate of consumption per whatever billing period you want to use increases. And again, this is only really possible if the monopolist who's selling this good has a good deal of information about the demand curve so that it's able to roughly, skim the extra willingness and ability to pay from each consumer as you move up the demand curve. In order to be able to engage in secondary price discrimination, a firm has to be able to meter the services that's consumed by the buyer. So in this case, it's the actual meter on the electrical box that's outside your house. It could be when people actually called on their cell phones, use them to make phone calls instead of just using them as smartphones. It'd be the minutes that each consumer was being charged on their plan, binning them into either someone who makes a ton of phone calls versus someone who only makes a smaller number of phone calls. And finally, we come to third-degree price discrimination. This is the most common form of price discrimination and the kind that you might actually, come into contact with in your day-to-day life. So basically, what happens in third-degree price discrimination is that the monopolist segregates the consumers into different markets, and then they sell to those different markets at different prices. So you can set the market segmentation based on geography, on age, gender, product use, income, any of those sorts of things. So one example is matinee movies. People that tend to go to matinee movies are either unemployed, college kids that have a lot of free time during the day, families with small children, or they're retired. So they tend to sell a lower price to people in those markets because they have lower incomes. On the other hand, in the evenings, more people want to go to those movies, and they go after work or on the weekends. They're going to be more expensive because people with a higher income are going to be going to those. So they split it up that way. They also do obviously discounts for college students. So you can use your student ID a lot of places near college campuses and get discounts. That's another way to practice third-degree price discrimination. Now let's look at third-degree price discrimination in more detail. If a firm could successfully do it, it would increase their profits above what they would be able to earn with a single price. So let's assume that a firm operates in two markets, here represented by market A and B. Market A is a demand curve that is relatively inelastic, meaning it's not responsive to a change in price. Market B, on the other hand, has a much more elastic demand curve. So a larger change in the quantity demanded will occur in response to a change in price. Panel C shows us the total market demand, combining both markets A and B. Now the reason we see a little kinked demand curve, we see it steeper at the beginning and then it becomes more shallow, is because the market B's demand curve ends below market A's demand curve. We're assuming that the products being sold in both markets A and B are homogeneous, so they're exactly the same. If we do that, we can draw one marginal cost curve for the firm. So in panel C. Output is going to be where the marginal revenue for the total firm is equal to the marginal cost for the total firm, where MR sub T equals MC sub T. If the firm charged just one price, it would be at point C there in panel C. However, the firm could increase their profits by segmenting these markets, so by acting differently in market A versus market B. To see what would happen if the firm was able to segment these markets, we can take a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost for the entire firm and trace that over through the two different market segments. In each, the firm will be producing where this line crosses the marginal revenue curve. That's the quantity that they're going to produce at for each market. So trace that quantity up to the demand curve to determine the price for each market. So for instance, market segment A, which has relatively inelastic demand, we're going to end up with a price of PA, which is higher than if the entire market received the same price. Now, market segment B has more elastic demand, so it would end up having a lower price than the whole market would. And this makes sense because people in market B, these consumers are more sensitive to a change in price. So your text is a numerical example, but I won't force you to do all that. I think the graphs here are enough to represent and let us know what's going on here without needless confusion. So what are some examples of price discrimination in the real world? Well, one old example is healthcare. A long time ago, when physicians would make house calls, they would charge their patients different prices based on their income. So they would charge, their higher income patients more money for the same procedures that they would charge less money to lower income patients to make sure everyone was able to get health care. The example I gave earlier in the chapter of theaters, movie theaters have matinee showings for very low prices, and they have, much higher prices on like Friday or Saturday night when everyone wants to go. The crowds they tend to attract during the week to those matinee showings are old people, college students, kids. So a group of people that are more sensitive to a change in price than the people going on Saturday nights. And finally, the hotel industry is another example. Of course, different rates for hotel rooms have existed for a long time in the industry, but hotel chains are very good at discriminating by segmenting the market. So splitting it up into business travelers versus leisure travelers. Leisure travelers, they can go at any time, they can stay longer, they often make commitments long in advance, whereas business travelers are booking more at the last second, and they are less concerned about the price. The price elasticity of demand is relatively more elastic for them because they have to go to a specific place at a certain time. Somewhat related to price discrimination is what's called a tying arrangement. Under a tying arrangement or a tie-in sale, a buyer of one product is obligated to buy a related product, usually a complementary good, from the same supplier. Now, U.S. antitrust law does not like this. They consider the practice to be illegal, or I guess they declared it illegal, and they consider it something that flows from monopoly power. However, economists believe it's a form of price discrimination. The reason they consider price discrimination is because they can segment the markets into two separate groups that are demanding the product, the main product. Some are going to want to use it a little bit, some really want it, are going to use it quite a bit. So what they do is charge the same lower price to buy that first initial good, so say like a printer in the printing industry, and then they charge a higher price for that second good that consumers are locked into buying. So for the printers, like printer cartridges. So people that use it just a little bit pay that low price to get the printer, and then they pay a higher per unit price for the printer cartridges, but they end up not spending that much. Those that really do want to use it and are going to use that printer quite a bit end up paying a lot. They end up paying more for the product that's tied to it, so the printer cartridges in this case. There are some other explanations that can explain tying arrangements. So one is quality control. So firms tend to argue that the reason they force people to use, printer companies force people to use their printer cartridges is because of quality. They need to ensure the integrity of their machines, that other cheap inks aren't getting in there and ruining them, and then making their quality appear lower because of that. Another is efficiencies in distribution. So firms can achieve a lower cost if they can save by delivering both products to the same company rather than delivering one and then delivering the other product. Sometimes that person, sometimes someone else. And finally, the evasion of price controls. If there's a price ceiling on one of the two products, then they can get around that by charging a higher price on the other product. And the example your textbook gives was IBM back in the day. A little bit less relevant now that IBM is not the quite near monopolist that they used to be. So antitrust law in the United States does not look favorably on the practice of price discrimination by firms. They believe it leads to a lessening of competition, and they think it makes consumers worse off. Overall, economists looking at the welfare implications for all of society are uncertain whether it improves or worsens overall social welfare, because it's difficult to compare the benefits that some consumers get by paying lower prices that other consumers get for paying higher prices. There's some places where you can see this makes sense, like for example, like the movie theater example. It helps people go see cheap movies during the day that don't have much money otherwise, and firms can make money because they have the facilities running. It's higher fixed costs and variable costs in the movie theater industry. But you can imagine other industries where the benefits are not so clear-cut. So far throughout the text, we've assumed that business leaders calculate a demand schedule and then work out the marginal revenue, marginal cost curves, and use that in order to maximize their profit. But in reality, how many actually go through this process? I'd guess very few. But the market forces them to behave as if they do oftentimes. So their actions are very similar to someone who was setting the price where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So while the models may accurately represent how businesses appear to act, in reality, when they're making decisions, they probably don't go through that same thought process. Additionally, businesses aren't always profit maximizers as well. We've assumed that so far in the text. Some are like, Ben & Jerry's or Tom's, where they have like a philanthropic side to their business, but many more target other metrics. So it could be their goal is to maximize their revenue. It could be to achieve a certain level of market share in a certain industry. It could be to maximize their profit margins or increase their equity by a certain percent. There's a lot of other alternatives that they could choose to target rather than just trying to maximize their profit. So they set a minimum profit level that they feel comfortable with, that they think is a manner of success, and then they try to maximize some other area subject to that minimum profit that they're willing to deal with. Now, one method not using the marginal analysis for setting the price is called cost plus pricing. So if you surveyed a bunch of business people, asked them how they set their prices, odds are the most popular one would be cost plus pricing. Basically, what you do is to choose your price, you calculate the variable cost, you add to that an allocation for the fixed cost, so a certain percentage of the fixed cost is going to go to each of the products that you're making, and then you add a certain percentage or a markup. So for example, if your variable cost for a product is $8, and the overhead that you allocate to it, so the proportion of the fixed cost you put to there ends up being $6, and you want your markup to be 25%, what you would do is add the $8 to the $6, so the variable cost and a portion of your fixed cost, to get $14. Then you'd multiply that by 25%, end up with $3.50 for that. So you add them all together. So the $14 plus the 25% markup, $3.50, to get $17.50. Now there are some problems with cost plus pricing that's worth mentioning. First is, how are the average variable costs being calculated? That's important to know and can be difficult to do in practice. Another is, how are the fixed costs being allocated? And why are fixed costs being included in this calculation? So economic theory says that fixed costs do not affect the price, so why are we adding them in here? Finally is, how is the size of the markup determined? So sometimes people say that it should guarantee the seller a fair profit, but what does a fair profit mean? Your text goes on to show how cost plus pricing can lead to similar results as marginal pricing in practice. Now the mechanics of how that happens aren't important, but the result is important to know that in practice they can be very close to each other. But now in the real world, marginal pricing can be difficult to actually do for managers. The reason being that demand curves are really difficult to estimate. To be able to get the data is very costly and difficult, and it requires a lot of work. So an alternative that firms can use is called incremental pricing, or incremental costing analysis. So incremental pricing deals with changes in total revenue and total cost that results from a firm's decision to change prices or the products that they're offering. So they consider, if we change the prices, what's going to happen to our total cost? What's going to happen to our total revenue? Now, the only thing that they consider is the total revenues and costs that are going to change when these decisions are considered. So only the things that are possibly affected by change. So they're leaving out basically fixed costs. And now, because this is incremental and they're talking about changing prices by a certain amount, it's similar to marginal analysis. Not exactly the same, but again, in practice, it's the same basic idea underlining it. So examples of some of the things that you would use incremental pricing or incremental costing analysis for is a new product. Should you introduce a new one and discontinue an old one? Or should you just discontinue one old product? Should you offer an improved version of the product? Should you buy new capital equipment? And of course, should you change your price, increasing or decreasing? Much of our analysis uses simplifying assumptions to make the models as simple as possible to work with, and so we can focus on only the things that really matter, what we're trying to learn through these models. And I'll try to mention that repeatedly throughout the course to remind you guys so you don't think that we think that business is that simple. If business was simple, I'd be out there doing that myself instead of here teaching. And now we'll briefly consider when our firm produces multiple products, not something we've considered before. In the past, we've assumed that the business is only producing and selling one good, again, to keep the analysis simple. So now, if production is totally independent of two goods for a firm, which means that demand and costs for one product do not affect the demand and the cost for another product, then this is no different than before. Everything's totally separate. They're not related to each other at all. It's as if the firm is only making one good. You can treat them both completely separately. But this is rare. In real life, the goods are somehow going to affect each other. So in case one, we call it fixed proportions, the products are complements in terms of demand. So one company may produce both personal computers and software. So typically complements, they go together. Or a fast food restaurant might sell hamburgers and soft drinks. Obviously, restaurants sell a lot of complements. All their dishes, or at least most of their dishes, can be considered complements. Another case is what we call variable proportions. So products are substitutes in terms of demand. So a company may produce different models of a PC. The automaker may produce different actual models. Soft drink company might bottle soda. They might do lemon lime soda. They might do lemonade and like other beverages. And these are going to be substitutes for each other. So people are going to purchase one or other of the products. They're not going to purchase both. So the third case is when products are joined in production. So there's going to be some overlap. So the production process for one good is going to be a portion that is going to be the same as a portion of the production process for another good. In the extreme, the production process can be the same or almost the same. So you can imagine, how about cattle production, where you get one skin of the cattle, used for leather, and then the carcass or the body, the meat that's used to be sold. Those are produced, in a fixed proportion together. And the final one, the fourth case, is when products compete for resources. So if a company's making different products that compete for the available resources, it'll have to do so at the expense of producing less of the other one. So if they're both, say, a company produces two types of leather goods, if you produce more of the one type of leather good, you have to produce less of the other type. In the complex world of modern business, many companies have subdivided their operations into different divisions that focus on, specific or related tasks. So that way they're not wasting management in one area that doesn't have, the expertise over, to run over the whole company. They break it up so they can have individualized silos where they have more expertise on what they're actually doing. These companies can get extremely bloated and it can be difficult for them to operate. One of the things that they've done to try to remain profitable and to keep costs down is to engage in what's called internal pricing. So as a product moves through these divisions, whether it's through like the layers of production, going from like the very rough early stages of production to like the final finishing stages before the product's shipped out and ready to go to consumers, they will have it sold or transferred from one division to another using a sort of price to recognize that. A lot of automakers use that. Coke Industries, a conglomerate, is famous for doing that and using as much internal pricing as possible, trying to create a little market inside of the firm. There's an issue with using transfer pricing within a firm, between the multiple divisions. The problem is that each individual segment has an incentive to maximize their profits if that's what management sets as the overall goal. So what would happen is they would try to set their profits as high as possible. Their prices that they would, try to sell to the next division would be as high as they possibly could, and they would try to buy at the lowest possible price. If each of them tried to maximize their profits, then the firm would end up with costs that are exceedingly high. They're way too high for them to function in the market once they try to sell the good, to actual consumers, not just dealing within the firm. So you need some type of coordination to make sure that these divisions are not trying to meet their own individual incentives and maximize, their profit or whatever. They need to make sure that it's all done to maximize the overall profit of the firm. So the design of this transfer pricing system within the firm has to be geared towards maximizing total company profit. So typically you need some high level that oversees all the divisions setting these goals and targets. So you need to somehow centrally plan or dictate what this company policy is. So it may not be that each division within the firm tries to maximize their own firm's profits. It may be that they somehow set it as a subset of the firm's total profit. Okay, so there are two cases we're going to look at. The first case, there are no external markets. So let's imagine a firm, and to simplify, we're going to imagine that they have two divisions within this firm. The one is going to manufacture the components that are used in final production. We'll call them Division C. And another that assembles them into the final production and sells it, Division A. So if there are no external markets, that means that Division A cannot buy components from any other competing firms. They can only buy from Division C. And Division C cannot sell their components to any other companies. So that means that the two firms or divisions within the firm have to deal with each other, and they do so by producing equal quantities. So whatever Division C produces, Division A is going to use and turn into the final goods. So we end up with in this situation, one demand curves and two marginal cost curves for each of those divisions within the firm. And to get the overall marginal cost curve for the firm, we're just going to sum the marginal cost curves vertically. And you see that in figure 10.9 in your textbook. In order to determine where to produce, you just set the marginal revenue equal to the total marginal cost, or the marginal cost of the entire firm. Then you decide to produce at that quantity, and then you trace up from that quantity to the marginal cost curve, to the demand curve, and take that over to the price. So basically what we've been doing with producing in monopolistic competition so far. But often, and usually, it is possible to sell outside of the firm, and for the firm to source inputs from other suppliers rather than just the component division. So in these cases, when there's external markets present, divisions have the opportunity to buy and sell outside of the firm in competitive markets. Now, if the selling division prices above the external market price for the components, then the buying division, the final assembly division A, will buy from the outside. They won't buy from inside the firm. If the selling division can't produce enough to satisfy the buying division's demand, so division C can't produce enough for division A, then division A is going to buy additional units from the external market. So now the pricing of the product is going to proceed as in the following manner. Division C is going to produce at the point where its marginal cost curve equals the market price. Because there's a competitive market out there, the demand curve is going to be horizontal. So the uniform price, no matter the quantity and no matter where they purchase from. So the cost of the intermediate product for division A is going to be the market price. This is going to be added to division A's marginal cost curve. So we use that to obtain the total marginal cost curve for the final product, which we're going to vertically sum like we did in our previous slide. Production is going to take place at the quantity where the total marginal cost equals the marginal revenue for the final product. And again, at that quantity, we're going to trace that up to the demand curve for the overall product, for the final product, and then trace that point out to the price. This is going to look very similar in nature to the to figure 10.9, but you can see this in figure 10.10 in your textbook. And now we're going to end by briefly touching on a few other pricing practices. So the first one worth mentioning is price skimming. So now the first firm to introduce a new product may have a temporary monopoly. Again, if they're the first, for some point in time, they're probably going to be the only one offering a product unless someone jumps in at the same exact time with them. They can use this temporary monopoly to charge higher prices and obtain economic profits until competition begins to enter and compete those prices away. We talked about being a first mover a little bit earlier. Monopolistic competition, this is the same basic idea. There's also penetration pricing. So in penetration pricing, a company is going to set their price relatively low in order to obtain a market share. This can be when they're first entering an industry that they haven't competed in before, when there's mature members of the industry. It could be when they're expanding regionally as well. So Sheets used to be accused of this when they were slowly expanding out from Altoona, but I think they were still in Pennsylvania. They would enter a new place, just a little bit to the east of where they used to be. They drop the price of their gas, just under their competitors in order to gain market share. Another pricing practice worth mentioning is called limit pricing. So we say monopolists will set the price where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost in order to maximize their profits. If there aren't high barriers to entry or perfect barriers to entry, it's possible that other firms could begin competing against them. They may set their price below the monopoly price. That'll allow them to discourage potential competitors from entering the market and competing against them. So even though at this lower price, the monopolist's profit is going to be below its maximum, it allows them to keep more profit in the long run rather than having to deal with competition. Another type of pricing practice is called predatory pricing. So this is where a company prices below its marginal cost, and the purpose being to cause competition to exit the market. Once the competitors leave the market, they're no longer competing in there, the company can then raise its prices and be a monopolist. This practice is illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's also very rare, even without antitrust acts, to see this happen, in the real world. Some people accuse foreign firms of doing this, and when they are able to do this, it's because they're getting, money from their government in order to keep them from, I don't know, basically from going bankrupt. A firm cannot engage in predatory pricing in the long run, and in a free market, anyone would be able to, short their stock. People know that the firm would not be able to last long enough, so it's not it can't credibly commit to predatory pricing for long enough for firms to believe them and be willing to exit the market. So in practice, there's been a few times in like U.S. history when firms have tried to do this before Sherman, and they weren't able to successfully pull it off. Another thing that companies sometimes use when they're trying to determine price is prestige pricing. So for some goods, demand curves may actually slope upwards for a portion. This happens when a higher price for a product gives consumers a sort of prestige, or they think it signals a higher level of quality. So sometimes it's true for luxury goods. Dean Fry in marketing classes used to talk about this example all the time. I'm sure he still does, about the watch company that was selling like $2,000 watches. They were pretty decent, and they had like average, middling sales. One day they decided, well, what the hell, we're just going to jack our prices up to $6,000 per watch and see what happens. And their watches started flying off the shelves. Suddenly people thought they were a luxury watch, and they were willing to spend a lot more money to buy it. And finally, the last is psychological pricing. So demand for a product may be quite inelastic over a certain range, but eventually it will become elastic at one specific price, whether it's higher or lower. So this kind of demand curve is going to have the appearance of a step function. And when I say step function, I mean literally looks like looking at a set of steps from the side, where it's horizontal and vertical, horizontal and vertical. We're just briefly touching on this. Your textbook has like 2 paragraphs on this total. It's important to know these different types of things. I might give you like 1 or 2 multiple choice questions on it. But if you really want to know these more in depth, in your marketing classes, you'll learn more about them. And I think those professors will be better suited to teach you about those.